The garage door rolled up with a mechanical groan, revealing not tools or storage boxes, but a wonderland that made Jake's 7-year-old eyes grow wide as saucers. This, his neighbor Mr. Wilson said with unmistakable pride, is 30 years of model railroading. Jake's father David stood speechless, his hand still resting protectively on his son's shoulder, as they gazed at the miniature world that sprawled across the entire garage, a decision that would change their broken family forever. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected connections and healing, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming content that reminds us how community can transform lives when we need it most. David Parker hadn't planned on making friends in the new neighborhood. After losing his wife Sarah to cancer 18 months ago, he'd moved himself and Jake to this quiet suburban street for one reason only, to escape the memories that haunted their old house. Every corner there had whispered Sarah's name, from the kitchen where she'd dance while cooking Sunday breakfast to the garden she'd lovingly tended even during her final summer. The weight of her absence had become unbearable, pressing down on David's chest each morning he woke alone, crushing him a little more each time Jake asked when Mommy was coming back. The modest 3-bedroom they'd found on Maple Street was nothing special, just a place to sleep, eat, and try to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. David had taken to working longer hours at the architectural firm, leaving Jake with a rotation of babysitters who never seemed to last more than a few weeks. He told himself it was necessary to secure their future, but deep down, he knew he was running from the responsibility of being both parents to a child who needed more than he felt capable of giving. Their elderly neighbor, Harold Wilson, had waved from his driveway that first moving day, but David had only managed a distracted nod in return. In the 3 months since, their interaction had been limited to polite nods when retrieving mail or taking out trash. David had noticed the man's meticulous lawn care and the curious hours he kept in his garage, but curiosity wasn't something he had energy for anymore. It was Jake who had initiated the connection, as children often do with their unfiltered interest in the world. David had been searching for his son one Saturday afternoon, panic rising in his throat when the backyard proved empty, only to find him peering through the slats of their shared fence. "Mr. Wilson has trains," Jake had announced with the first genuine excitement David had heard in his voice for months. Lots and lots of trains. That evening, Harold had appeared at their door with a plate of chocolate chip cookies that his sister had baked. "Notice the little one watching today," he'd said, his weathered face creasing into a kind smile. "Thought I might extend an invitation for a proper viewing. That is, if you're interested." David had almost declined. Social interactions required energy he didn't have, and forming new connections meant potential new losses. But Jake had appeared behind him, eyes hopeful for the first time in forever, and David found himself nodding. "Maybe next weekend," he'd said, not committing fully. But Harold Wilson wasn't easily deterred. The following Saturday, he'd caught them in the driveway as they returned from grocery shopping. "Beautiful day," he'd observed casually. Then, with a twinkle in his eye that spoke of childlike enthusiasm despite his 70-plus years, he'd smiled at Jake and asked, "Want to see?" David hadn't even blinked before Jake was nodding vigorously, grocery bags forgotten. The model railroad kingdom that filled Harold's garage was nothing short of extraordinary. Mountains rose from painted plaster, tiny trees dotted realistic landscapes, and miniature people populated small towns with impossibly detailed buildings. Trains of every variety wound through tunnels, crossed bridges, and stopped at stations smaller than Jake's hand. "Started when I was about your age," Harold told Jake, who stood transfixed. "My father bought me my first Lionel set for Christmas in 1958. Been building ever since." As Harold demonstrated the controls, explaining how each train operated on its own circuit, David found himself drawn into the intricate world despite his determination to remain detached. The precision of the scale models appealed to his architectural sensibilities, and the obvious passion behind the decades-long project stirred something he'd thought had died with Sarah, appreciation for beauty created by human hands. "My Margaret used to say I loved these trains more than her," Harold said with a soft chuckle that held equal parts humor and sadness. "Wasn't true, of course. She helped design half these buildings before her arthritis got too bad. Been gone 7 years now. David felt a jolt of recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Harold nodded, understanding passing between them. Life goes on, even when we think it can't. These trains helped. Having something to build, to create, it matters. That first visit stretched into hours, with Jake asking endless questions and Harold answering each one with grandfatherly patience. When they finally left, Jake clutched a small boxcar Harold had insisted he take, to start his own collection. "Can we come back?" Jake asked as they walked the short distance home, his voice tentative, as if expecting disappointment. David looked down at his son's face, hopeful, animated in a way he hadn't seen since before Sarah's diagnosis, and felt something crack in the protective shell he'd built around his heart. "I think Mr. Wilson would like that," he said. The visits became regular, Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. Harold taught Jake the basics of model railroading, starting with simple track layouts and gradually introducing more complex concepts. David found himself drawn in as well, his professional skills useful when Harold mentioned wanting to add a new suspension bridge to the layout. "I could draw up some plans," David offered hesitantly one evening, after Jake had gone to the bathroom. Harold's face lit up. "Would you?" "My eyes aren't what they used to be for the detailed work." That night, David stayed up until 2 in the morning, sketching designs for a miniature bridge that would span the river, in Harold's layout. It was the first time since Sarah's death that he'd drawn anything not related to work, and the familiar flow of creativity felt like rediscovering a part of himself he'd abandoned. As summer turned to fall, their lives began to intertwine with Harold's in unexpected ways. When David had to work late, Jake would spend time at Mr. Wilson's Railroad Museum, as they'd taken to calling it. Harold taught the boy card games Sarah had never had patience for, told stories of growing up in a different era, and listened with genuine interest to Jake's school adventures. "He reminds me of my grandson," Harold confided to David one evening as they watched Jake carefully position tiny pine trees along a mountain slope. "Lives in Seattle now. Don't see him nearly enough." David recognized the loneliness in the older man's voice, the same emptiness that echoed in his own chest on quiet nights. "We're lucky to have you as a neighbor," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity behind the words. The first real test of their newfound friendship came in October, when Jake's school scheduled its annual father-son camping trip. David had managed to avoid it the previous year, Jake still too fragile after losing his mother. But this year, Jake brought home the permission slip with obvious excitement. "Mr. Wilson says he used to go camping all the time," Jake informed David over dinner. "He showed me how to tie different knots today. Said every camper needs to know them." David felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the panic that arose whenever he faced doing something Sarah would have helped with. She had been the outdoorsy one, the parent who knew how to pitch tents and build campfires. David's idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service. "I don't know, buddy," he hedged. "I've got a big project due that week." Jake's face fell, but he nodded with the resigned acceptance that had become his default response to disappointment. The sight of it twisted something in David's gut. The next day, David found himself knocking on Harold's door, permission slip in hand. "I don't know the first thing about camping," he admitted when Harold answered. "Sarah always handled that stuff." Harold studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Got any plans this weekend? We could do a trial run in my backyard. Nothing builds confidence like practice." That Saturday, Harold's backyard became a camping boot camp. He pulled ancient equipment from his attic, a canvas tent that smelled of mothballs, sleeping bags that had seen better days, and cooking gear that predated microwave ovens. With methodical patience, he walked David and Jake through each step of setting up camp, from selecting the right spot to securing tent stakes. "The secret to a good campfire," Harold explained as they arranged kindling, "is building a proper foundation. Just like a house, or a model railroad, for that matter. Get the base right, and everything else follows. By Sunday evening, David had learned to start a fire without lighter fluid, cook a decent meal on a camp stove, and identify 3 constellations Harold insisted every camper should recognize. More importantly, he'd seen Jake beam with pride when they successfully erected the tent together, father and son working as a team. The school camping trip went better than David could have imagined. Armed with Harold's tips and a new confidence in his abilities, he navigated the weekend without major disasters. Jake introduced him to his friends with obvious pride, and for the first time since Sarah's death, David felt like he might actually be doing okay as a single parent. "Mr. Wilson wants to know all about it," Jake said on the drive home, his voice heavy with sleep after the exhausting weekend. "I told him we'd come over tomorrow to tell him." David glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, struck by how easily Harold had become a fixed part of their lives. "We'll bring dinner," he decided. "I think he'd like that." As autumn deepened into winter, their connection with Harold strengthened. Thanksgiving found the 3 of them around Harold's dining table, which he admitted hadn't been fully extended since Margaret was still hosting the family. David contributed a passable turkey, following Sarah's recipe, which he'd finally had the courage to retrieve from her collection, while Harold prepared side dishes from his late wife's handwritten recipe cards. To absent friends, Harold toasted, raising his glass with a solemnity that acknowledged the empty chairs in both their lives. And to new ones, David added, surprising himself again with the emotion behind the words. December brought new challenges. The holiday season had been brutal the previous year, their first without Sarah. David had gone through the motions for Jake's sake, but the joy had been absent, the tradition's hollow echoes of happier times. This year, Harold suggested they combine forces. "My house has the space for a proper tree," he offered, "and I've got boxes of ornaments gathering dust. Margaret would hate to see them unused." Together, they transformed Harold's living room into a Christmas wonderland. Jake hung ornaments with careful deliberation, asking about each one's history. Harold had a story for every piece: the glass ball his parents had bought on their honeymoon, the handmade star Margaret had crafted from clothespins, the tiny train engine that had been his first Christmas gift to her. "She pretended to be excited," he recalled with a chuckle. "Took me years to realize a model train wasn't exactly what she'd hoped for from her new husband." David found himself sharing stories too, how Sarah had insisted on color-coordinated ornaments until Jake was born, then surrendered to the chaos of handprint reindeer and popsicle stick photo frames. The memories still ached, but the sharp pain had dulled to something almost sweet, like pressing on a bruise that was finally healing. The model railroad took on a holiday theme, with Harold and Jake working together to add miniature Christmas trees to the tiny town squares and string barely visible lights along the miniature Main Street. David contributed a scale model of the town's clock tower, complete with a working timepiece no bigger than a dime. "You've got a gift," Harold told him, examining the intricate details of the model. "Ever thought about doing this professionally? There's good money in custom pieces for serious collectors." David hadn't considered it, but the seed was planted. His architectural work had always been about function and efficiency, but these small-scale creations allowed for an artistry he'd forgotten he enjoyed. Christmas morning began at David and Jake's house with presents and pancakes, then continued at Harold's with more gifts and the dinner Harold insisted on preparing. "Been cooking for myself for 7 years, he said when David offered to help. "Let an old man have his kitchen." Among the presents Harold gave them was a large, flat package for David. Inside was a framed architectural drawing, yellowed with age but beautifully preserved. "Margaret's father drew this," Harold explained. "Original plans for the town library, built in 1932. Found it when we cleaned out his office after he passed. Thought you might appreciate it, professional to professional." David was speechless, running his fingers over the precise lines and elegant notations. It was a museum-quality piece, something Harold clearly treasured. "I can't accept this," he protested. Harold waved away his objection. "No sense keeping it in my closet. Better with someone who understands its value." For Jake, Harold had assembled a starter set of model train equipment, an oval of track, a simple engine with 2 cars, and basic landscaping materials. "Every railroad baron needs his own kingdom," he said with a wink. Jake's eyes were wide. "Can I set it up in my room?" "I was thinking," Harold said, glancing at David for approval, "that we might clear a space in my garage. A section just for your layout, next to mine but your own to design. If your dad agrees, of course." David nodded, throat tight with emotion at the joy on his son's face. His own gift to Harold seemed inadequate in comparison, a leather-bound album where he'd carefully mounted photographs of Harold's entire model railroad, professionally shot and organized by section. But Harold's hands trembled as he turned the pages. "No one's ever documented it properly," he said, voice rough. "Always meant to, but never got around to it." He looked up, eyes bright. "This is a gift beyond price, David. Thank you." As winter melted into spring, their lives fell into new patterns. Jake spent afternoons working on his growing railroad section under Harold's tutelage. David found himself sketching designs for buildings and landscapes, rediscovering the pure pleasure of creation without client specifications or budget constraints. Harold's health took a concerning turn in March, nothing dramatic, just a persistent cough that eventually led to a diagnosis of early-stage COPD. "Consequence of too many years of my father's cigarettes in the house," he explained after returning from the doctor. "Nothing to worry about yet, but I'll need to take it easier." David and Jake naturally stepped up, taking over lawn care and grocery runs. David installed a smart thermostat that Harold pretended to be suspicious of but secretly appreciated. Jake appointed himself medication reminder, solemnly informing Harold when it was time for his daily pills. "You two don't need to fuss," Harold protested one evening after David had insisted on cooking dinner. "I'm not an invalid." "We're not fussing," David replied, stirring the pasta sauce Sarah had taught him to make. "We're being neighbors." Harold's sister Elaine visited from Florida that spring, staying for 2 weeks in April. She pulled David aside one afternoon while Jake and Harold were engrossed in wiring a new section of track. "I want to thank you," she said, her resemblance to her brother striking despite her more delicate features. "Harold's different since you and Jake came into his life. He has purpose again." David shook his head. "We're the ones who should be grateful. Harold's been, well, he's been exactly what we needed." Elaine patted his arm. "That's how it works with the good ones. They give you what you need, and somehow get back what they need too." She glanced toward the garage where laughter could be heard. "My brother was fading after Margaret died. Just going through the motions. Now he's making plans again, talking about the future." The observation stayed with David long after Elaine returned to Florida. He realized that somewhere along the way, he too had started thinking beyond the next day or week. He'd begun sketching designs for his own projects in the evenings, creating intricate buildings and structures that had nothing to do with his day job but brought him a satisfaction he'd forgotten was possible. In May, an opportunity arose that would test the bonds they'd formed. David's firm offered him a significant promotion, one that would mean more money and professional recognition, but also a transfer to their Chicago office. "It's a great opportunity," his boss emphasized. "The kind that doesn't come along twice." David took the weekend to consider it, walking through the quiet house while Jake was at a friend's birthday party. The logical choice was clear: better schools for Jake, career advancement for himself, a fresh start in a vibrant city. But the thought of leaving their small house, the neighborhood that had finally begun to feel like home, and especially Harold, created a heaviness in his chest he couldn't ignore. When he picked up Jake that afternoon, he broached the subject carefully. "How would you feel about moving to Chicago? My company has a big office there, and they've offered me an important job." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the car window. "Would we still see Mr. Wilson?" "We could visit," David said, knowing how inadequate that sounded. "And he could come see us sometimes. But not like now."